Welcome listeners, today is the last episode of the week-long Creepypasta Black-Eyed Kid stories. But far, far, far from being the last episode I do on BEKs. Trust me. Perhaps next time I'll do a synopsis on what a BEK is, and the range of different kind of BEK sightings out there. I reckon that'll be something worth investigating. So, to cap off this week, I wanted to end on a high note for Black-Eyed Kid stories. So, I bring you 4 creepypastas to chill your bones. The titles are as follows. From the Mouths of Lambs, Come Play With Me, Terry, and lastly, Black-Eyed Kids in Kansas. Also, the story titled Terry is not a Black-Eyed Kid story per se, but hear me out. It's the first ever story I found that discusses white-eyed kids in a black-eyed kid capacity. I was fascinated by the story. Not to mention, it gave me this terrible vibe that the Japanese horror film The Grudge brings. So strap yourself in, lovers of the creepy, turn the lights off, check the time, and don't answer your door beyond midnight after these stories. And of course, get ready for the creepy. It had been an unreasonably mild November day, and my lounge was flooded with the kind of beautiful caramel light that only seems particular to bright autumn days. My fiancé and sports coach at a local secondary school had left that morning for a tour with his rugby team. "Are you sure you'll be alright without me?" John had asked before he left, cupping my face between his large hands, calloused from too much hockey. "Actually, I can't wait to have a break from you." I laughed, ducking away from his reactionary tickle, and chivying him out the back door, where I stood to wave goodbye. "Okay, you little toughie," he'd chuckle as he climbed into his car. "But remember, no playing with matches, no running with scissors." "How about talking to strangers?" I'd called, as he pulled away, waving a huge hand out of the window. So now I sat down to begin the long but not entirely unpleasant job of filling in Christmas reports for the children at the nursery school where I worked. I loved my job, and was good at it. Despite the endless paperwork and the gradually diminishing pay, I also honestly loved to spend time alone. I'd pour myself a large glass of wine and set a Nina Simone vinyl playing on my beloved record player, feeling surprisingly content despite the long night of work ahead. Jamie is a very polite, well-behaved boy who has begun to show a real interest in drawing. So Nika has become a little more confident and is now very sociable with other children. Layla has been working very hard on her numbers and is always the first to tidy up after herself. The children under my care, all aged from 2 to 5, were generally delightful. They were at that inquisitive stage of life that informed so much of their character, when the seeds of who they'd later become were sown. I filled in the reports at an impressive rate, stopping only to replenish my glass and change vinyls, reveling in the freedom of being home alone. I worked on, uninterrupted, until there was a knock at the door, which jolted me out of my reverie. Standing up, I glanced at the clock and saw that I'd been absorbed in my work for several hours. The music had stopped playing without me realizing, and the sky, visible through the large windows, was now a luscious midnight blue. There was a second knock, this time from the back door. I was somewhat startled. I hadn't heard anyone walk down the path by the house, which led to the garden, but also relieved. Only our friends and family knew that the front door was in fact locked and bolted, as it led directly into John's office. This meant that any knocks from the back door almost certainly meant it was someone we knew, and wanted to see. I swiftly passed from the lounge into the kitchen and opened the Yale lock on the back door, puzzled by the decidedly short shadow in the frosted glass. I swung the door open and did a double take. Standing on the back patio, looking down at the floor, was the sandy head of a young boy. "Oh," I heard myself say in surprise, before a confident voice interrupted. "Good evening. I'm so sorry to disturb you. Can I come inside? I was immediately struck by the intelligent little voice with which the boy spoke. Still slightly dazed by the sudden interruption, I tried to take in who I was looking at. The boy seemed to be around 12 years old, with blondish and freckled skin. It struck me that his clothes seemed more suited to a younger boy. He wore knee-length shorts, a dark blue jumper with a sailboat motif, and shiny buckle-up shoes. I'd seen it before. Children being dressed by a parent who weren't quite ready to accept their child's aging, instead trying to contain them in a time warp, perpetually 6 years old. However, these children usually complied with this, either attaining the painful shyness of their early years or constantly teetering at the edge of a tantrum. However, this child was precocious, a confident, calm boy who seemed unperturbed by the dark closing in around him and perfectly content to knock on the door of a stranger, unannounced. Nonetheless, he kept his chin tucked into his chest, apparently examining his shoes in a rictus of timidity. Pardon? I stammered, still taken aback by the situation. Good evening. I'm so sorry to disturb you. Can I come inside? The boy repeated, even reproducing the inflection of his first statement. Crouching down, I tried to peer into his face. His eyes were tightly clenched shut. Are you alone out here? I asked gently. Have you lost your parents? I couldn't explain the acid-like sense of nerves that was beginning to rise in my stomach. There was something about this boy that was making my fingers tingle as though he had some terrible deformity, but he looked perfectly normal. I chalked it up to the strange circumstances of a knock late at night and began to look around for another sign of life. My back garden ran straight into a field and the nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. Can I come inside? The boy insisted. I was now beginning to feel irritated, and straightening up, folding my arms, I gave myself a small shake and forced myself into work mode. Why do you want to come inside, hey? Where are your parents? I asked firmly, despite the jittering in my chest. I'm happy to help, but I need you to explain what happened. There was a pause, and I got the distinct impression the boy was deciding what to say next. It was similar to when I found kids stealing biscuits from the nursery kitchen. I could practically see the cogs turning to generate an excuse. His shoulder rose and fell with his quick breath, and his fist clenched in anticipation. Do you promise you won't be angry? The boy said, in an expressionless voice. It was almost as if he was reading the phrase aloud for the first time. He asked flatly, awkwardly. The rolling in my stomach was now, decidedly, fear. I'm sure there's nothing to be angry about, okay? I said, crouching again, and trying to look into the little boy's eyes, his eyes still tightly clenched. Just tell me why you're wandering about here, and we'll sort it out. My imagination was beginning to run wild with the shadows. I began to imagine that this was just a decoy, that he was part of a gang, waiting just beyond my line of vision, to run into the house, or maybe he himself was a thief, carefully disguising himself as a child. I was beginning to panic, when the boy suddenly seized my hand. His fingers were cold and dry, surprisingly strong. Slowly, as if he was balancing something on his head, he began to raise his face to mine, and began to open his eyes. I understood why he kept his eyes shut. I found myself looking into two onyx pits, shiny, oil-black eyes, without pupils, irises, or whites. I could see my own shocked face reflected twice back at me. I gasped, recoiled, and the boy's lips curled in angry response. You said you wouldn't get angry, he hissed, his childlike face warped with rage. I felt myself flush red with shame, and immediately regretted my reaction. What if it was some kind of birth defect or disability? I thought of the children at work and tried to backtrack. No, I'm not angry at all, I cried, waving my hands as though fanning a fire, in what I must have felt was a pacifying fashion. Listen, why don't you pop inside and we'll try to call your parents, I said pleadingly. I immediately wished I had not. Just as quickly as the anger had come, it was gone. The boy widened his slow-coloured eyes. Now, he truly did look disfigured, as though his mouth had been slashed into an impossibly wide grimace. You need to say it properly, he said. What do you mean? I asked shakily. I was beginning to understand what felt so wrong about the boy. The year before, my grandmother had died from cancer, and I had sat by her bed in the hospital for the last few days of her life, holding her hand. I loved my grandma dearly, but there had been something wrong during those last few days. Something sickening. It was as though her dying body had changed the very essence of her, as if she had one foot in each world. Now, just like then, I had that feeling. My whole body was reeling away from an unmistakable presence. Death. What happened to you? I breathed, my own words surprising me. Ask me inside. I'll tell you. No, Ask me inside, he whispered incessantly, now calm and compelling. He already knew he'd convinced me. His huge black eyes were now moist, filled with anticipation. He seemed almost to drool. I blinked, took a sharp breath. My body was moving without my will. I was stepping back from the door, spreading my arms wide, never once looking away from his eyes. Come inside, I said. I'm home, John cried as he shunted the back door open with a shoulder, heaving his bag inside, listening for a response from Mia. He was met with silence. Mia, he asked again, shutting the door behind him and walking into the kitchen exhausted. A bottle of white wine stood on the counter, still warm. John chuckled and scooped it up from the side. Seriously? He shouted, still laughing to himself. It's not even 10 a.m. Was it that hard to spend a week without me? Silence. Then, from behind the door to the hallway, a thud. Mia? John called, moving toward the hall. Don't even try to scare me. I will tickle you until you... The door swung open. John staggered back, gagging. The carpet in the hall was completely saturated, no longer beige. It was impossibly crimson, soaked with blood, surely more blood than one body could possibly hold. The air was thick with it, the walls splashed, as though something had been thrown in it. The week that had passed since its first spill had let it warm around the radiator. It was beginning to dry and flake. By the door, a large pile of mail was soaked. John was frozen, almost hypnotized. It was then that he noticed a heap at the bottom of the stairs, like a pile of discarded clothes. It too was covered in blood, but John distinctly recognized Mia's grey cardigan. His body seemed to understand before his mind did. With an involuntary whimper, he realized something in the pile was moving, jerkingly, savagely. He had only a moment in which to wonder, horrified, what it was, when an emaciated hand dropped onto the sodden carpet, knocked aside. As the small blonde figure arose from the other side of the heap with something wet and purplish in its mouth, John could only wonder dimly, deliriously, which piece of his fiancée was the last thing he'd see. All credit of this creepypasta goes to Luella. Your second story. Stepping through the doorway, I had to hold up a hand to cover my eyes. The sun was incredibly bright, and there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. This had given me the sad delusion that there was some semblance of warmth to be had. But The bitter cold air shattered that happy thought. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, doing the top button up that I always hated to do. It brought on feelings of claustrophobia, probably linked to the fact that it constricted my neck ever so slightly. My shoes hit the tarmac and I began to walk out into the playground, a line of excitable children following me out before dispersing among the play equipment. Some sat in small groups on the circular benches, loudly talking about political power within the class. A smile crept over my face. Who knew 11-year-olds could discuss things in a way to make them sound like teenagers? Other classes were emerging now and a few more teachers to help keep watch. Jenny caught my eye and smiled, and I gave her a small nod in reply. Soon the playground was swarmed with children, running around, playing games, excitedly discussing television shows, and which video games they were playing. Plenty felt the need to come and share this information with me, and I went along with this, laughing and smiling. Although they could be the cause of a few accidents, the playground in a primary school often felt like one of the happiest places to be. I was content, but obviously alert to any potential dangers. It was then that I noticed her. There was a small girl, younger than the age I taught. Maybe 6 or 7 years old from her build, but she was slumped in a corner, next to a fence, hugging her knees to her chest. She wasn't wearing a coat, nor was she wearing the school jumper with our logo emblazoned on the front of the chest. She was sat on concrete, huddled in shadow, her dark hair cascading over her face as she looked down. She must have been freezing. I assumed she'd had some sort of argument with a friend and was away from the others, either sulking or genuinely upset. Either way, I had to console her and to send her back inside to get her coat. I walked over and squatted down next to her, getting to the same level as her to make sure she didn't feel at all threatened. "Hey there, are you okay?" She shook her head, shaking some hair loose from her shoulders so that it covered even more of her face. "What happened?" Silence. It was at this point that I began feeling uncomfortable. I had no idea why. I'd had conversations just like these a dozen other times. Some children felt like talking, some needed consoling, some just needed space, and we gave them that. They usually spoke when they were ready. This situation though, something about it had me on edge, to the point I could actually feel the adrenaline kick of a flight or fight response. "Aren't you cold?" Another shaking of the head. Then a meek voice came forth from the mass of hair. "I never get cold." Some of us never grew out of that bravado, but children almost always responded like that. They were never too cold or tired or anything else that could be perceived as weakness, at least not when asked. "Well, I think we need to get you inside to get your coat, or at least your jumper." "No." The voice was no longer meek. It was commanding, and the head shifted slightly so that it was raised more towards me, revealing her face to me. I tried my best not to, but I recoiled slightly. In this light, the shadow of the fence, her eyes appeared entirely black. No iris, no sclera, just pure black ovals reflecting my own face. She sighed gently and her eyes closed again. "I want to play." "Well," I began, slowing my breath and keeping the momentary fear out of my voice. "You can play after we get your jumper." "Will you play with me?" "Sure." She tilted her head back now, the hair falling away as her eyes snapped open suddenly. Again, those eyes, the pure black pools reflecting my own concerned face. "We have to play. You have to play with me." I had stood up and taken a few steps back. She was shaking now, but it didn't seem to be shivering. There was no fear, and nothing about her that suggested she was cold. It literally looked like she was shaking in anger. Her blank, expressionless face had contorted into one of anger, her eyes narrowing and her lips pulled back until her teeth were bared. I had stumbled back a few more steps and then had frozen. I felt simultaneously terrified and embarrassed. I was a senior teacher in a playground full of children and other staff and was retreating in horror from one infant. I opened my mouth to speak, and then the bell went. The ringing, which symbolized the end of playtime. The anger vanished from her face, and her eyes closed again, as children rushed around me, between us, none of them stopping to look at her as she rose from the ground. I found my feet and walked towards where my own class were lining up. My eyes locked on her as she stood upright, and once more, I was shown the darkness behind her eyelids. Her lips pulled into a smile that chilled me more than anything I had encountered in my teaching career, and then, lost in the throng of running children, I lost sight of her. Once she was out of my sight, it was easy to dismiss what I had seen as just a trick of the light, my own senses tricked, causing me to become afraid, which in turn caused my senses to let me down again. I lost sight of her. I never saw that girl again, never noticed her, so I couldn't confirm or disprove what I had seen, and I moved schools not long after that, transferring somewhere closer to home. I had begun to put it out of my mind, dismiss it entirely. Then, I stumbled upon a newspaper article, one which spoke of a black-eyed girl who had been frequently seen in Staffordshire. Looking into it, I found hundreds of accounts of those who had witnessed the black-eyed children, all describing the same sense of fear, dread, and foreboding which accompanied them, and the anger the children displayed when it was discovered they were anything but normal. Apparently, most of these involved these black-eyed children asking to come into your home, saying they need help, or coming up to your car begging for a ride. I have no idea what happens if you allow them in, and the teacher in me would find it difficult to turn them away. All I would say is, look them in the eye before saying yes. All credit to this story goes to Pazuzu's Crypt. And time for our next story. Arthur Willow lay awake, listening to the rustling noise in his closet. He was 14, much too old to believe in the cliched thought of a monster in a closet. Yet, as he tried to force himself asleep for yet another time this month, the rustling grew louder than it had before. Whenever this noise occurred, he justified it as a rogue toy, or a raccoon stuck in the wall. There was no point in checking the closet. He had before, and there was always nothing there. So, the sound continued on into the night, until, as per usual, Arthur finally shut his heavy eyelids. "Arthur, breakfast!" His mother's voice echoed up from the kitchen. Arthur rubbed his eyes, rolled out from the warmth of the covers, and started his routine. He opened the door to his closet, glancing around at old toys, a pile of clothes he outgrew, and a rather large bunny his grandparents had given him for Easter. He never found anything during this routine, and that gave him some comfort. "How did you sleep, honey?" Arthur's mum asked as she plopped 2 pancakes out of the frying pan onto his plate. Arthur was always impressed with how strong she was after his dad passed away. "Wonderful," Arthur lied. His mother gave him a worried look, patted his messy hair, and started cleaning dishes. Arthur finished breakfast and put on his coat. The freezing air nipped at his cheeks as his shovel sank into the driveway snow. Neighbor children ran up and down the block, pelting each other with snowballs and making snow angels. Arthur watched the snowflakes fall briefly, then returned to the warmth of his home. Arthur removed his coat, sat on the couch, and began to read. The noise had become more frequent. Silent nights were becoming rare. Sleep deprivation had caught up to him, and Arthur took a much-needed nap. He awoke to gunshots. Arthur's eyes flew open, and he sat straight up. Through panicked breaths, his eyes raced around the room and saw cowboys on television in a shootout. Mary, his little sister, had turned on the TV while she was in the cushy recliner holding a doll. "Mary, you should have let me rest." "I sorry." Mary looked genuinely sad. She was only 3, so it was near impossible to be upset with her. Arthur's mother walked into the room, and the rest of the evening was spent in the living room with his family. Before his father passed away, having a good relationship with his family was not as important. Now, they relied much more on each other. Everyone said goodnight and Arthur returned to his room. He uneasily laid down under the covers and waited. Just as Arthur was on the edge of sleep, it began. Arthur was starting to believe he was going insane. Once again, he forced himself to sleep. He awoke to his closet slamming. At first, it didn't register with Arthur. He rolled over and looked at the clock. It was 5 a.m. When his sleepiness drifted away, he sat up staring at the closet door. Using the sliver of morning sunlight available, Arthur could see that the floor in front of the closet was damp. He quickly flung open the closet door, threw the pile of clothes out of the closet, scattered toys, and chucked the rabbit. There was nothing. Arthur replaced the contents of his closet and returned to bed. He laid in bed wide awake until breakfast. At breakfast, he sat down, and his mother gave him waffles. "Some neighbor children built the cutest little snowman in our yard," his mother said while she handed him syrup. "I'll take a look at it when I go to shovel snow," Arthur replied. The snowman outside was small and poorly made. It had classic twigs for arms and rocks for eyes. A scarf was loosely wrapped around its neck. The scarf seemed familiar to Arthur. It was blue with small rubber ducks scattered all over it. It was exactly like a scarf Arthur wore as a child. In fact, it was Arthur's scarf. Arthur ran back inside and searched for his sister. "Mary? Mary?" Arthur jogged upstairs and checked his sister's room. Mary sat on the floor colouring from the light of the window. "Mary, did you build a snowman outside using my scarf?" "Terry did it," Mary replied without looking up from her colouring activity. "Who's Terry?" Arthur analysed Mary, trying to figure out if this was some sort of joke. "My friend." Mary seemed completely serious. "When do you see Terry?" Arthur asked, feeling his heart sink. "Night. He watches us." Mary kept colouring away, as if the conversation was normal. Arthur lay awake that night. No matter how much sleep gripped him, he wanted to stay awake and watch. He forced his breathing to become very slow, to appear to be sleeping. Around 3 a.m., Arthur heard something very strange. The sound of shifting floorboards. He deduced, and then the door opened. To Arthur's shock, the rabbit plopped out of the closet and remained motionless. Arthur couldn't believe it. The rabbit was alive? This made absolutely no sense. It had most likely been purchased at a Walmart by his grandparents. How was an Easter toy alive? While Arthur's eyes were fixed on the rabbit, the door slid open more. A small boy slowly stepped out of the closet. He stood there seemingly staring at Arthur. Arthur became so terrified, but kept his determination and remained still. The child had dark brown hair and murky grey skin. His eyes remained fixated on Arthur, unblinking. Arthur stared in horror as he realized the boy's eyes had no pupils or color. They were completely white. For minutes, which felt like hours to Arthur, the disfigured child stood in the moonlight watching Arthur. The horror of the situation had overtaken him, and he laid in bed, paralyzed by his gaze. After around 20 minutes, the intensity of the situation had become too much, and Arthur began to cry. The small child almost appeared to be startled by the sound. He slowly walked across the room, appearing to study Arthur. Arthur remained completely still as the child approached. The child's cheeks were sunken and his white eyes were glazed over. The child stopped getting closer when their noses almost touched, and Arthur could feel his breath. Then, the child shrieked. Terry's scream made Arthur's stomach churn, and he leapt backward on the bed in terror. Suddenly, Terry ran out of Arthur's room and down the hall. Arthur remained frozen with his back to the wall, staring at the entrance of the room. While processing what had happened, he reflected back to what Mary had told him. Had he ran into Mary's room? The overwhelming fear of this creature was stifled for the welfare of his sister. Arthur grabbed his battered baseball bat and headed down the hall. He half whispered, half yelled, "Mary! Mary?" while he slowly walked with his bat up, checking every corner. Finally, he made it to Mary's bedroom. Her window was open and cold air was rushing into the room. Arthur turned the lights on and searched the room. Mary was gone. The police were called to the Willow family home that night. Arthur never spoke to his mother or the cops about what happened. The police said they found 2 sets of small footsteps side by side in the snow, leading to the woods before they disappeared. They searched the neighborhood and woods long into the night, to no avail. Early that morning, Arthur once again searched the closet. He recalled back to the noise of the floorboards shifting. Then he started putting pressure on the floor. The boards gave in a little, and Arthur managed to pull out a few. Beneath the floor, Arthur found an odd crawl space. This must be where Terry had been hiding, right under the rabbit, beneath the floor. Inside, he found some of his old toys and various drawings. The drawings consisted of what Arthur could tell was Terry and Mary. Arthur became sick when he saw that Mary had grey skin and white eyes. The last picture had Terry and Mary on a distinct hill in what appeared to be the woods. Arthur stared at the hill and realized he had seen that place before. When he was younger, he played in the woods and more specifically on that hill. Arthur grabbed his coat and boots, then sprinted out the door into the cold morning air. He rushed through the woods, dodging rocks and limbs. Off in the distance, he saw the hill from his childhood. As he approached, he began to make out the figure of Mary laying in the snow. "Mary? Mary!" Arthur yelled as he dropped to his knees beside her body. Her skin was grey and frostbitten, her hair slightly covering her white eyes. "Mary, wake up." He gingerly picked her up and checked for a pulse. There was none. "Mary, you can't die. You're my sister," Arthur said with tears running down his face. Mary slowly turned her head and screamed. All credit to this story goes to Zulast. And up next is our last and final story. It was warm for a December afternoon in Hutchinson, Kansas. When Katie came home from work in 2008, Katie's ride dropped her off across from her duplex, and as she stood in the street, her ride moving slowly away, she knew something wasn't right. I noticed 2 boys standing in my driveway. One had longer dark hair and the other had his hood up, so I couldn't see him very well. The teenagers, about 15 or 16 years old, seemed to be watching her. Katie felt they were waiting for her. She steeled herself and walked nervously across the road toward her porch. The boys had lurked around her neighborhood for months, but they'd never been so bold to stand so close to her home. I had seen them before, lingering in the yard, but they always left before I got out of my ride's car, Katie said. I had seen them late at night, as well as standing across the street when I would go outside to have an occasional late-night cigarette. But although pangs of unease told her to run, their boldness angered her. She stopped and asked them why they were on her property. They told me they needed to use a phone and that the neighbor would not let them in, she said. That was when I noticed their eyes. They were coal black, just black. No white and not even a hint of iris or pupil. But as evenly as she could, Katie told them that she didn't have a telephone. Katie walked up her porch steps and began to unlock her door when the boy in the hood spoke. He asked if they could come in for a glass of water, she said. I turned to look at them, again thinking my mind was playing tricks, but no. When I turned and looked into their eyes, they were pitch black as the first time. These children with dead black eyes had spoken softly to her, emotion and vocal inflection absent from their words. As she looked at these boys, with long hair and hooded sweatshirts, She felt their clothes hid more than just skin. She knew she had to get away. I felt panicked and fearful, but also very vulnerable and cold, she said. It was like I wanted to let them in, but I knew there was evil present. I had felt uneasy before seeing their eyes, but now it all came out. Then one boy said something that turned her fear into complete terror. The hooded one then told me they couldn't come in unless I told them it was okay, and that they hoped I would because they were thirsty, Katie said. I opened my door and darted inside. At this point, I shut the door and locked it. She dropped onto the couch, her breaths coming in short, heavy gasps, when something tapped on the window behind her head. One of the boys stood there, staring through the glass, Katie said. I remember his words very clearly. Just let us in, miss. We aren't dangerous. We don't have anything to hurt you with. I was beyond frightened at this point. Katie jumped off the couch and ran through the duplex, checking doors and windows to make sure they were locked. I did wonder if they really couldn't come in unless invited, but I didn't want to find out, she said. I sat in the living room silently waiting for a sign that they had gone. When her boyfriend came home a short time later, the black-eyed teens were still at the house. He asked if I knew who the two boys outside were, and I said, no, Katie said. He told me they had been standing in the driveway when he pulled up, but walked away when he stepped out of the car. He didn't notice the boys' eyes, but they gave him a strange feeling. Katie later asked her neighbors if the black-eyed children had asked to use their telephone, like they had claimed. The neighbors noticed the teens standing in Katie's driveway but never spoke with them. Although it's been more than a year since Katie turned the black-eyed children from her door, she knows they're still around. I see them every now and then standing across the street watching, she said, but they have not approached again. Written by Jason Offut. Well, what did you think? Did you enjoy the BEK stories? Do you have any BEK stories of your own or that you want read out? The 4 stories today were just brilliant. But of these stories during the week, what would have been your favourite? I'd like to know. My favourite would have to be The Fourth Child. Definitely freaky. If you have any questions about BEKs, email me or hop onto my website and ask me a question there. Any questions that I do get, I'll include them in the closing notes of the next episode. And before you have yourself a fantastic weekend, if you know anyone who loves the macabre and terrifying, then send me to them so that I can chill them to the bone. Figuratively. And thank you all so much for listening. And yes, it is that time. This is the place where stories live, and you telltellers come to listen. Enjoy your day or night, and join me every weekday for our creepy tradition. And as always, till next time.